Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. When Dr. Tony Fauci testified on the Hill yesterday, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Hahn, Dr. Fauci.
Is there a doctor in the house?
Dr. Redfield, Dr. Hahn, Dr. Fauci. Admiral Jawar. Get him in there, break it up. But Dr. Fauci had this to say about the prospect of reopening.
As I've said many times publicly, what we have worked out is a guideline framework of how to safely open America again. And there are several checkpoints in that, with a gateway first of showing, depending on the dynamics of an outbreak in a particular region, state, city, or area, that would really determine the speed and the pace with which one does re-enter or reopen. So my word has been, and I've been very consistent in this, that I get concerned if you have a situation where the dynamics of an outbreak in an area are such that you are not seeing that gradual over 14-day decrease that would allow you to go to phase one. And then if you pass the checkpoints of phase one, go to phase two and phase three. What I've expressed then and again is my concern that if some areas, cities, states, or what have you, jump over those various checkpoints and prematurely open up without having the capability of being able to respond effectively and efficiently, my concern is that we will start to see little spikes that might turn into outbreaks. So therefore, I have been being very clear in my message to try to the best extent possible to go by the guidelines, which have been very well thought out and very well delineated.
For more on the reopening, what we know, what we don't know, what we need to know to feel safer, we're pleased to be joined by Chris von Csefalvay. Hope I got that right. Epidemiologist specializing in bat-borne viruses, currently VP of Special Projects at Starshima. Chris Csefalvay, is that right?
Yep, that's about right.
Csefalvay. Right. All right, great. Thank you. So with respect to what Dr. Fauci had to say about, the guidelines that are often referenced, just more generally, rather than getting into the details, is what you've heard in terms of the path back to some reopening as the reopenings occur state by state, based on what we know and what we know about the virus in terms of its contagiousness and lethality. Does the approach, generally speaking, make sense to you?
Absolutely. So the plan to reopening is actually a very good, very cautious, and a very data-driven plan, and that is actually what you would want from a plan like this at a time like this. So it is very strongly anchored in the fact that we now have a huge advantage, which we don't normally have in outbreaks, which is that we have a lot of data coming in, very granular data, very high-quality data on how many cases there are and how this virus behaves. So that allows us to monitor the situation on the ground quite consistently, and from that derive these next steps. Now, I have to probably say that this is a plan that's primarily concerned with rapid suppression of the outbreak. It is not a comprehensive plan for all things. And when epidemiologists put these plans together, for us, the success criterion is get rid of the disease, smash it back where it came from, and just have a healthy population. I think Dr. Fauci understands, I understand, all epidemiologists understand that there are other concerns as well, such as the economy, such as possible mortality and morbidity caused by the lockdown. So there is often mental health issues have been mentioned in that context. So, but this is a more complex social, political, economic issue. But from the epidemiological perspective, this is what you want a model to look like, or what you want a reopening plan to look like.
And when you say squash it down, get rid of it, does it mean have a vaccine before epidemiologists think that it's safe to reopen fully?
I think epidemiologists have a tendency, and I myself am probably as guilty of that as anybody else, to be a little bit like an overprotective parent. So we don't want the population entrusted to us to come to any harm. So obviously we would feel most comfortable if there were either treatment or a vaccine around. At the same time, I think that may be a long time. So there are over 70 vaccine candidates being considered at the moment. There are, I think, 5 or 6 in various stages of clinical trials. Some are very promising, but it still takes time to test and develop these vaccines. And for that reason, I'm not sure that practically we can keep the lockdown going for the 12 to 18 months that it will take to develop these vaccines.
Right, and that's a maybe in terms of developing those vaccines. That's not a fait accompli. That's a maybe you'll get a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. So if that's impractical, then does it make sense to do something like Sweden has done from the beginning?
My experience is that it is not necessarily clear that the Swedish approach is really preferable or better. The Swedish approach greatly relied on letting the disease essentially take its course, infect as much of the healthy population as possible, and generate sufficient immunity to at least approach what we call the herd immunity threshold. So if you have a given percentage of the population who have gone through the infection and who are now immune, then we have reached a state after which the disease is seriously hampered in how it can propagate through that population. For this novel coronavirus, that threshold is approximately 60% of the population. If we can reach that without overwhelming the healthcare system, that would be probably good. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to reach those numbers safely. And most importantly, the main flaw of the Swedish approach is that we do not really know who is at a higher risk. So obviously there are people, especially people who are elderly, people who have serious comorbidities, etc., who, if they get sick, they probably stand a worse chance of a favorable outcome at the end. But there are also people who are unaware that they might have a heart arrhythmia, a heart defect, they might have various other adverse health factors, people you would regard as healthy, but still would be at high risk.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but here's the thing. If you don't get a vaccine and a lockdown for 12 to 18 months is impractical, which it is, I agree with you, then it's going to happen anyway. So, I mean, it seems to me like where there's some utopian option that we have that comes without risk. You mentioned at the outset the trade-offs of lives versus lives, between the lives caused by the lockdowns, mental health, and those afraid to go to the hospital, get the treatments they need, and so forth, versus the lives being taken by the virus. So we have a lives versus lives trade-off. We can't lock down for 12 to 18 months, which epidemiologists would recommend in a perfect world, in a utopian world. And we may or may not get a vaccine even in that time period. So, and that's impractical to lock down. So then what choice do we have? It's going to be that path, is it not?
Probably the best approach in this case is to have very strong, very gradual surveillance of cases.
Mm-hmm.
So, like very granular, I mean, not even county level, even lower level surveillance of cases.
Can I just stop you there? Because I'm glad you brought up contact tracing, because that's where I wanted to go next. Contact tracing, which I know has become one of the watch phrases of the political set, just parroting what epidemiologists and scientists are saying. Keith Humphreys, who's a psychologist over at Stanford, brings up a good point. Here's where, best case scenario and then the real world complications. He writes, most of my great public health colleagues are greatly overestimating the likelihood the U.S. can mount a national test, trace, and isolate program like Germany and South Korea. My friends are mistaking a political cultural challenge for a technical one. It's not that we can't do the technical side brilliantly. Of course we can, he argues. What he's saying is hard questions are going to drive hard answers and answers that may not be acceptable. So, for example, what do you do when millions of Americans refuse to take your test? What do you do when many of the people you order to isolate to close their businesses angrily refuse, as some are doing right now? Those questions I know are not necessarily the purview of epidemiologists, they're the purview of public policymakers. But in terms of modeling anything that has any practical application, it seems to me Professor Humphrey's considerations need to be factored in.
Well, they might not be the purview of epidemiologists, but they definitely are part of our experience. So I have been at the receiving end of anger and some fairly strong reactions in contact tracing during previous outbreaks. I've been participating in the West African Ebola outbreak and later in the Congo Ebola outbreak. And, there were times when we were essentially chasing away by sticks and guns. So that is something that is probably one of the less preferable parts of field work in epidemiology, and something that most epidemiologists, I suppose, are quite familiar with, or at least quite somewhat accept. Now, perfect contact tracing, again, is something that doesn't really happen. It's also us, somewhat of an external observer. I've lived all over the world. I've only recently moved to the United States. My understanding is that the social and political attitudes in the U.S., and this isn't any particular political party, this is just how the average U.S. citizen conceives of his relationship with the state and the collective, probably make a wide contact tracing and testing program where we mandatorily test everybody, not necessarily popular and almost definitely not feasible. There's also, of course, the fact that the comparators that we get, South Korea, Germany, etc., there is the United States is big, okay, I'm saying the obvious here, and very populous. When you come to 330 million people, that's not a continuation of how you deal with 60 or 80 million people. That's a qualitatively different problem, not just quantitatively. It doesn't lie on the same continuum. It isn't you scale up your solution and you do more of it and you put more money of it. It is an entirely different problem, and it's never been done in history.
Right.
We've never tested hundreds of millions of people.
No, I know. And by the way, I mean, half the counties in the United States have zero COVID deaths. So, I mean, but part of the frustration is treating rural Wyoming the same way we're treating New York City rhetorically. Some politicians are. It's super annoying because, as you say, they're qualitatively different environments and they have a qualitatively different presentation in terms of the COVID-19 threat, it would seem. But I mean, what you're saying in terms of like all of the challenges and impossibilities and impracticalities is exactly what I'm saying. Is people who sort of poo-poo the Swedish model. What I'm hearing, and when you intersect a practicality with optimality, is the Swedish model was going to happen more likely than not, whether you want it to or not.
I think it's going to be slightly different. I think it's going to be slightly different in that what we can do in the U.S. is we do not need an American model, so to speak. There's no need for that, and in fact, I don't think that would be sensible. Sweden, again, it's relatively inhomogeneous when it comes to European countries, but it's still way more homogeneous than the U.S. We don't need a U.S. model. We don't even need a New York or Illinois model. What we need is to look at the smallest units we can and very, very granularly, relying a lot on data, determine what to do on a county or possibly even sub-county level. So there is, I live in Fairfax County, Virginia. There is no reason to treat Fairfax County the same as Alexandria, which is a much more urban, much more concentrated, higher population density area with a lot of businesses. So we actually, for the first time probably in history, have the tools to have county-level measures and essentially start easing counties that are going the right way, or even sub-county units, start easing them if they go the right way, keeping resources in reserve to tightening back very rapidly as soon as signs start to show that
and
going the right way.
And do you expect, as Doctors Fauci and Gottlieb and others have suggested, that it's more likely than not we'll have a second wave of infection come the fall and winter?
It's almost definite that there is going to be a second wave.
Mm-hmm.
I am skeptical as to whether the second wave will be anything as bad as the first. The United States is a little bit like a big vessel, like an aircraft carrier or something. It takes time to turn it, but when it gets going, it really gets going. So the U.S. got late in the game with testing, for instance, but once it got started, you could just see, and I was so incredibly impressed by the sheer industrial ability to scale this very complex technology and to develop new technologies. We will be much better prepared and eventually weather coronavirus infections. So most coronaviruses cause just a cold, and they're very common. Children have them all the time. There are very few highly pathogenic coronaviruses like COVID-19, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, the SARS coronavirus, the MERS coronavirus. The rest, they're completely common colds.
Well, we're going to have to
go back to that level.
We're going to have to leave it there. Appreciate it. He is Chris von Csefalvay. Chris von I got to get that. Csefalvay. I got to get that more fluid. Chris von Csefalvay, epidemiologist specializing in bat-borne diseases, current VP of Special Projects at Starshima. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Dan and Amy.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
You've all probably heard of asbestos and know that it's dangerous. You may also know exposure to asbestos is the only known cause of mesothelioma, a deadly cancer. People who were exposed to asbestos decades ago are being diagnosed to this day with mesothelioma. That's because it can take as many as 30 or even 50 years to develop. But did you also know there is money to pay victims of asbestos exposure from years ago? An estimated $30 billion is available to help compensate victims and their families. If you or a member of your family have been diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be able to receive some of this money without ever going to court or filing a lawsuit. Get a free legal review today. Call Sokolov Law at 1-800-972-3229. That number again, 1-800-972-3229, 1-800-972-3229. Call today, 1-800-972-3229.
Nothing speaks louder about an auto dealer than a happy customer. And at Joe Cotton Ford, they have many.
Typically, the car buying process, I think a lot of people would agree that it's not a pleasant experience. You look forward to buying a car, but the actual having to negotiate and purchase a car can sometimes be an ugly thing. And the one thing that I've always had here in 19 years, every time we purchased a car, it's been a pleasant experience.
Another reason why folks keep coming back to Joe Cotton Ford. Right now, Joe Cotton Ford is offering 0% financing